Imagine waking up one morning and discovering that the person staring back at you in the mirror is a complete stranger. Not physically, the face is familiar. The scars and lines map out a history you recognize. But the essence behind those eyes feels foreign, artificial, like a masterfully crafted performance that has been running for so long you've forgotten it was ever an act. Now imagine realizing that this stranger has been making every major decision in your life. They chose your career not because it aligned with your deepest calling, but because it impressed others. They selected your relationships based on social status rather than genuine connection. They crafted your opinions, your dreams, even your fears, all designed to maintain an image that was never really you. The most unsettling part? You willingly handed over control, piece by piece, year after year, until the authentic you became nothing more than a whisper in the background of your own existence. This is not a hypothetical nightmare. This is the hidden reality most people live every single day without ever realizing it. You believe you are living your life, but in truth, you are being lived by something far more sinister than any external force, a corrupted version of your own ego that has transformed from protector into tyrant, from servant into master. Here lies one of the most devastating paradoxes of human existence. The very psychological structure designed to help you navigate the world and maintain your identity has become the primary obstacle to actually discovering who you are. Your ego, which should serve as a bridge between your inner truth and outer reality, has instead become a prison warden, keeping your authentic self locked away while parading a carefully constructed imposter through the world. But what makes this prison particularly insidious is that it feels like freedom. The chains are invisible, woven from social approval, professional success, and the addictive drug of external validation. You believe you're climbing toward fulfillment, when in reality, you're sinking deeper into a sophisticated form of self-betrayal that would make even the most skilled con artist envious. Consider this. Every time you bite your tongue to avoid conflict, you're not keeping the peace, you're silencing your truth. Every time you pursue a goal because it looks good on paper rather than because it ignites your soul, you're not being practical, you're betraying your essence. Every time you laugh at jokes that aren't funny or nod along with opinions that make your spirit recoil, you're not being social, you're being complicit in your own erasure. The great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung understood this psychological tragedy better than perhaps anyone before or since. He recognized that most people's suffering doesn't come from having too much ego, as popular culture would have you believe, but from having the wrong relationship with it entirely. The ego, he discovered, was never meant to be destroyed or transcended. It was meant to be educated, refined, and returned to its proper role as ambassador of your deepest self rather than its replacement. But here's where the plot thickens. This isn't just personal dysfunction, it's a collective epidemic. We live in a world that actively rewards ego inflation, that confuses confidence with arrogance, authenticity with performance, and genuine power with the desperate need to control how others perceive us. Society has become a feedback loop that creates and celebrates the very psychological patterns that keep us imprisoned in lives we never consciously chose to live. What if everything you've been taught about the ego is not just wrong, but deliberately misleading? What if the real enemy isn't your ego itself, but your unconscious identification with a version of it that was shaped by trauma, rejection, and the toxic need to be accepted in a world that punishes authenticity? What if the path to freedom doesn't lie in ego destruction, but in something far more radical, ego transformation? The questions that emerge from this realization are both terrifying and liberating. Who would you be if you stopped performing? What would you choose if you weren't afraid of judgment? How would you live if you trusted your inner authority more than the opinions of people who don't even know themselves? And most importantly, are you ready to find out? If this psychological awakening is stirring something deep within you, if you're ready to stop living as a stranger to yourself, then what follows will fundamentally change how you see your mind, your relationships, and your entire existence. Subscribe now, because this journey into Carl Jung's most profound insights on ego mastery will challenge everything you thought you knew about who you really are. To understand how you became a prisoner in your own psychological house, we must first examine the architects of this invisible cage. The corrupted ego doesn't emerge from nowhere. It's a sophisticated survival mechanism forged in the fires of early trauma, social conditioning, and what Jung called the fundamental terror of being truly seen. From the moment you drew your first breath, you entered a world that demanded performance over authenticity. Your caregivers, themselves prisoners of their own unconscious patterns, began the process of shaping you into what they needed you to be rather than who you actually were. When you expressed joy too loudly, you were told to quiet down. When you showed vulnerability, you learned it was dangerous. When you revealed your authentic thoughts, you discovered they were often unwelcome. Slowly, methodically, you learned the most devastating lesson of human existence. Love is conditional, and the condition is that you become someone else. This is where Jung's concept of the false self begins to crystallize. The child, faced with the impossible choice between authenticity and acceptance, chooses survival. They begin to construct what Jung termed personas, social masks, designed to elicit approval and avoid abandonment. But here's the psychological trap. These masks, initially worn as protection, gradually fuse with identity itself. The persona becomes so convincing that even you forget it's a costume. Friedrich Nietzsche understood this process when he wrote about the herd mentality, the human tendency to sacrifice individual authenticity for group acceptance. But Jung went deeper, recognizing that this wasn't merely social conformity, but a fundamental split in the psyche itself. The ego, which should serve as a bridge between your inner truth and outer reality, instead becomes a wall that keeps the two permanently separated. The philosophical roots of this tragedy reach back to what Jean-Paul Sartre called bad faith, the human tendency to deny our own freedom and responsibility by pretending we have no choice but to be who others expect us to be. We tell ourselves we're being practical, responsible, mature, when in reality we're simply too terrified to risk the rejection that might come with genuine self-expression. Arthur Schopenhauer added another layer to this understanding with his concept of the will to live, the blind, unconscious drive that compels us to survive at any cost, even if that cost is our own soul. The corrupted ego becomes the executor of this will, sacrificing authenticity on the altar of psychological safety. It would rather have you live as a successful imposter than risk the vulnerability of being genuinely yourself. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of this process is how it becomes self-perpetuating. Once the false ego takes control, it begins to interpret all experiences through the lens of its own survival. Love becomes possession. Success becomes validation-seeking. Relationships become strategic alliances. The ego creates what Jung called complexes, autonomous subpersonalities, that hijack consciousness whenever certain triggers are activated. These complexes operate like psychological viruses, taking control of your behavior in specific situations. The child who was criticized for being too much develops a complex around shrinking themselves in relationships. The adolescent who was mocked for their dreams develops a complex around self-sabotage whenever success becomes possible. These aren't character flaws, they're psychological defense mechanisms that have outlived their usefulness. Viktor Frankl, who witnessed the ultimate test of human nature in Nazi concentration camps, observed that those who survived were often those who maintained connection to something beyond their ego's immediate needs, a purpose, a love, a meaning that transcended personal survival. This points to what Jung called the self, the deeper organizing principle of the psyche that the corrupted ego has abandoned in favor of social approval. The hidden problem, then, isn't that you have an ego, it's that your ego has been colonized by forces that have nothing to do with your authentic nature. Society, family systems, cultural conditioning, and unprocessed trauma have all contributed to creating an internal dictator that rules through fear, shame, and the desperate need to maintain an image that was never really you to begin with. This psychological colonization explains why so many people feel empty despite external success, why relationships feel performative rather than genuine, and why the pursuit of happiness often leads to deeper misery. You're trying to fulfill the needs of a false self, while your authentic nature withers in exile, creating an internal civil war that no amount of achievement, acquisition, or approval can ever resolve. The most terrifying aspect of living under the tyranny of a corrupted ego isn't what it makes you do, it's what it makes you unable to see. Like a master magician, the inflated ego performs its greatest trick by making its own operations invisible. You wake up every morning believing you're making conscious choices, when in reality, you're being puppeteered by psychological forces that operate entirely below the threshold of awareness. Jung called this phenomenon ego possession, a state where autonomous complexes hijack your consciousness so completely that you literally cease to be yourself in critical moments. Have you ever wondered why you become a completely different person when criticized? Why you sabotage opportunities just as they're about to manifest? Why you repeat the same destructive patterns in relationships despite your best intentions? These aren't character flaws or moral failures. They're evidence that your ego has been possessed by fragments of unintegrated experience that now control you from the shadows. Consider the neuroscience behind this psychological hijacking. When certain triggers activate your complexes, your brain literally shifts into survival mode. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thinking and conscious choice, goes offline, while the limbic system floods your consciousness with the same fight-or-flight responses that once helped you survive childhood trauma or rejection. In these moments, you're not responding to present reality. You're reacting to ghosts from your psychological past. This explains why intelligent, successful people can become completely irrational when their ego is threatened. The accomplished professional who melts down at the slightest criticism isn't weak. They're being controlled by an inferiority complex formed decades ago. The confident leader who becomes tyrannical when questioned isn't evil. They're possessed by a dominance complex created to protect against feelings of powerlessness. These complexes don't care about your current circumstances, your achievements, or your conscious intentions. They operate according to their own ancient logic of survival. But the consequences extend far beyond individual moments of irrationality. Living under ego possession creates what Jung termed symbolic survival, a mode of existence where maintaining your psychological image becomes more important than actually living. You begin to experience life through a filter of constant vigilance. How am I being perceived? Am I saying the right thing? Am I maintaining the persona that keeps me safe? This hypervigilance consumes enormous amounts of psychic energy, leading to the chronic exhaustion that characterizes modern life. More insidiously, ego possession distorts your perception of reality itself. The possessed ego doesn't just react differently, it literally sees a different world. Neutral comments become personal attacks. Opportunities become threats. Other people's success becomes evidence of your own inadequacy. You're not paranoid. You're living in a reality constructed by fear, where every interaction is filtered through the lens of potential rejection or humiliation. This perceptual distortion creates what psychologists call confirmation bias on steroids. Your complexes don't just interpret ambiguous situations negatively, they actively seek evidence to support their worldview. The person convinced they're unworthy will unconsciously sabotage relationships to prove their unworthiness. The individual terrified of failure will procrastinate to avoid the risk of trying. The ego creates the very outcomes it fears most, then uses these outcomes as proof that its defensive strategies are necessary. Perhaps most tragically, ego possession robs you of authentic relationships. When you're controlled by complexes, you're not actually relating to other people, you're relating to projections of your own wounds. You see threats where none exist, interpret love as manipulation, and respond to others based on scripts written by your psychological past rather than present reality. Your relationships become elaborate reenactments of old traumas, with new people cast in familiar roles they never auditioned for. The cultural implications of widespread ego possession are staggering. We live in a society where most people are walking around controlled by unconscious complexes, projecting their wounds onto each other, creating collective feedback loops of reactivity and dysfunction. Social media amplifies these patterns exponentially, creating digital environments specifically designed to trigger ego possession through comparison, judgment, and the addictive pursuit of external validation. This is why attempts at social change that don't address the psychological level often fail. You can't create a conscious society with unconscious individuals. You can't build authentic institutions from people who don't know who they authentically are. The problems we see in politics, relationships, and culture aren't primarily ideological, they're psychological. They're the external manifestations of internal possession by unintegrated complexes operating on a mass scale. The question that emerges from this recognition is both urgent and liberating. What becomes possible when you stop being a passenger in your own life and reclaim the driver's seat of consciousness? The path to freedom begins with an act of psychological rebellion so radical that it threatens the very foundation of how you've learned to exist in the world. This isn't the kind of rebellion that involves external acts of defiance. It's an internal revolution that challenges the deepest assumptions about who you are and why you behave the way you do. Jung called this process individuation. but it's more accurate to describe it as psychological warfare against the forces that have colonized your consciousness. The first weapon in this rebellion is what Jung termed brutal self-observation. This isn't the gentle self-reflection promoted in popular psychology. It's a forensic examination of your own psychological crime scenes. You must become a detective of your own unconscious, tracking the moments when you disappear and someone else takes control of your behavior. When do you become reactive? What situations transform you into a person you don't recognize? Which relationships turn you into a performer rather than a genuine human being? This level of self-observation requires what Jung called holding the tension of opposites. Instead of immediately identifying with your emotions or reactions, you learn to create space between the observer and the observed. When anger arises, instead of saying, "I am angry," you learn to say, "There is anger present." When fear grips you, instead of becoming the fear, you witness it as a visitor in your psychological house. This subtle shift in language represents a seismic shift in consciousness, the birth of what Jung called the transcendent function. The transcendent function is your ability to hold two contradictory experiences simultaneously without needing to resolve the tension immediately. You can feel afraid and still act courageously. You can experience anger without becoming violent. You can acknowledge your wounds without becoming your wounds. This capacity for psychological ambiguity is what separates conscious individuals from those possessed by their complexes. But here's where Jung's approach becomes truly revolutionary. He recognized that these complexes don't need to be destroyed, they need to be understood and integrated. Each complex carries within it a piece of vital energy that was split off during trauma or conditioning. The goal isn't to eliminate these psychological fragments, but to retrieve their energy and put it in service of your authentic self rather than your survival strategies. Think of someone who developed a perfectionist complex as a child to avoid criticism. Traditional approaches might try to eliminate the perfectionism, but Jung would ask, what authentic drive for excellence lies buried beneath this compulsive need for flawless performance? How can this energy be redirected from fear-based control to genuine mastery? The complex becomes not an enemy to destroy, but a wayward ally to redirect. This process requires what Jung called active imagination, deliberately engaging with your complexes as if they were separate entities with their own intelligence and purpose. You begin to dialogue with a part of you that self-sabotages, asking what it's trying to protect. You negotiate with the inner critic, discovering what standards of excellence it's attempting to uphold. You befriend the people-pleaser, understanding what genuine connection it's desperately seeking. Historical examples illuminate this path. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, spent his life in dialogue with his own psychological patterns, documenting his struggles with ego inflation and the corrupting influence of power. His meditations aren't philosophical treatises, they're the record of a man waging daily war against his own unconscious patterns. Friedrich Nietzsche, despite his later psychological breakdown, achieved periods of extraordinary clarity by ruthlessly examining his own motivations and drives, refusing to accept any belief or behavior that hadn't been consciously chosen. But perhaps the most powerful tool in this rebellion is what Jung called withdrawing projections. Most of your emotional reactivity comes not from present circumstances, but from unconsciously projecting old wounds onto new situations. The boss who makes you feel small isn't actually doing anything to you. They're triggering a complex formed by earlier experiences of powerlessness. When you stop projecting your past onto your present, you reclaim enormous amounts of energy that were being wasted on fighting battles that ended years ago. This withdrawal of projections creates what Jung termed psychological sovereignty, the recognition that no one can make you feel anything without your unconscious participation. This doesn't mean you become emotionally numb or invulnerable. It means you become responsible rather than reactive. You feel your emotions fully, but you're no longer at their mercy. The rebellion culminates in a fundamental shift of allegiance. Instead of serving the demands of your complexes, social expectations, or survival fears, you begin to serve what Jung called the self, the deeper organizing principle of your psyche that knows who you authentically are and what you're genuinely called to become. This shift doesn't happen overnight, and it's never complete. It's a daily choice to align your actions with your deepest truth rather than your deepest fears. There comes a moment in the journey of psychological awakening when all the theories, techniques, and insights converge into a single, earth-shattering recognition that changes everything. You are not who you think you are, and you never were. But more profound than this dissolution of false identity is the simultaneous emergence of something that was always there, waiting beneath the layers of conditioning, trauma, and performance, what Jung called your authentic authority. This is not the authority that comes from titles, achievements, or the ability to control others. It's not the fragile power that depends on external validation or the maintenance of an image. This is what Jung described as silent authority, a presence so grounded in genuine being that it requires no announcement, no defense, no proof of its existence. It simply is, and in its being, it transforms everything around it. When the ego finally surrenders its tyrannical reign and assumes its proper role as servant rather than master, something miraculous occurs. The constant internal warfare that has consumed your energy for years suddenly ceases. The exhausting vigilance required to maintain your personas dissolves. The compulsive need to prove yourself, defend yourself, or apologize for your existence simply vanishes. In its place emerges a quality of presence that people can feel but cannot quite name, the unmistakable signature of someone who has come home to themselves. This transformation reveals the ultimate paradox of human psychology. The more desperately you grasp for power, respect, and love through your ego's machinations, the more these very things elude you. But when you stop grasping, when you stop performing, when you stop trying to convince the world of your worth, that's precisely when you become worthy of everything you were chasing. Not because you've earned it through effort, but because you've finally stopped blocking it with your false self. Jung understood that this authentic authority emerges from what he called the marriage of opposites, the integration of every aspect of yourself that you've spent your life trying to reject, hide, or overcome. Your shadow, your wounds, your failures, your fears. All of these become sources of strength rather than shame when they're consciously integrated rather than unconsciously projected. The person who has faced their own darkness without being consumed by it carries a depth and authenticity that no amount of surface polish can replicate. This integration creates what can only be described as psychological alchemy, the transformation of psychological lead into gold. Your greatest wounds become your greatest gifts. Your deepest fears become doorways to your most profound courage. Your most shameful secrets become the foundation of your most compassionate understanding. Everything that once seemed like evidence of your brokenness is revealed to be proof of your humanity, and therefore your connection to all life. But perhaps the most radical revelation is this: when you stop trying to be special, you discover that you already are. When you stop trying to be different, you realize that your authentic ordinariness is extraordinary. When you stop performing uniqueness, your genuine nature reveals itself to be unlike anything that has ever existed or ever will exist again. The very authenticity that your ego feared would make you invisible actually makes you unforgettable. Living from this place of integrated authenticity doesn't mean you become perfect, enlightened, or free from all psychological patterns. You remain beautifully, imperfectly human. But now your humanity serves your wholeness rather than your wounds. Your emotions become information rather than directives. Your thoughts become tools rather than masters. Your relationships become opportunities for genuine connection rather than stages for performance. In this state, what Jung called authentic authority manifests not as dominance over others, but as sovereignty over yourself. You don't need to control anyone else's behavior because you're no longer controlled by your own unconscious patterns. You don't need to manage anyone else's perception of you because your sense of worth comes from within rather than without. You don't need to defend your truth because you're no longer attached to being right. You're committed to being real. This creates a ripple effect that extends far beyond your personal life. When you stop projecting your unconscious material onto the world, you begin to see reality more clearly. When you stop reacting from your complexes, you become capable of responding with wisdom. When you stop performing your identity, you create space for others to discover their own authenticity. Your individual liberation becomes a gift to the collective consciousness, proving that the most revolutionary act you can perform is to become genuinely yourself. The ultimate truth that Jung discovered, and that lies waiting in the depths of your own psyche, is this: beneath every mask, beyond every complex, deeper than every wound, there exists an indestructible essence, that is both uniquely you and universally connected to all life. This essence doesn't need to be created, earned, or achieved. It only needs to be uncovered, acknowledged, and allowed to express itself through the vehicle of your conscious choices. When you finally stop running from this truth, stop hiding from this power, stop apologizing for this light, that's when you discover that everything you ever sought outside yourself was always waiting inside yourself. And that discovery doesn't just change your life, it transforms your very understanding of what life itself can be. The ego you thought was your enemy was never your enemy at all. It was simply a lost child, desperate to belong, wearing masks it hoped would earn love. When you embrace this child with compassion rather than criticism, when you educate this ego with wisdom rather than warfare, it becomes your greatest ally in expressing your deepest truth. This is mastery. This is freedom. This is what it means to reclaim your life,